with my transmission.
Call!
Alright, brother. Thursday's the day. We're waiting for you.
The revolution starts tomorrow.
Yes,
The
sir.
fucking revolution.
That's it. Free
I
speech
know the
area.
staff has my back. I know the fucking staff has my back.
Martha.
Call!
Marooned and starving Moscow, nearsighted, impractical, frightened of automobiles and elevators, and without any means of support, the young Russian poet Marina Tsvetkina looked southward as the winter of 1918 neared its end. Her husband already had enlisted in the embryonic volunteer army that soon would become the backbone of the white forces in South Russia, and she longed to join him. Yet the lines of battle between red and white already had been drawn, and it would be 4 long years before she and her 2 small children could make the journey. Anxious to escape the constraints of the new order which she found so deadly, but condemned by circumstances to spin the civil war in the very center of Russia's red heart, Smeteva saw a time to come when thoughtful grandchildren would ask their grandfathers, "Where were you during those dark and terrible days of 1918? The reply she wrote in neat, brown schoolgirl letters in a small notebook from the American YMCA crashes forth like thunder. For men who believed in duty, valor, and honor, she insisted, the place to be at the beginning of 1918 must be on the Don. The Don. For centuries, those lands that stretched beyond the horizon in every direction to encompass more than 165,000 square kilometers of the Great Don River Basin in southern Russia, had stirred dreams of freedom in the minds of oppressed and restless men and women. Beginning in the 15th century, when Ivan the Great and his grandson Ivan the Terrible had began to gather the far-flung Russian lands under Moscow's rule, serfs and slaves from central Russia had fled to the Don lands, where they had found freedom from the Tsar's relentless tightening grip. With their Cossack allies to the west and the lower reaches of the Kuban, Volga, and Ayak rivers to the east, thousands of fugitives had lived close to their horses and to nature, free from want, servitude, and fear. Theirs was the steppe, a land as vast as it was virginal, where the grass grew taller than a man on horseback and stretched as far as the eye could see. Never had the plow cut through the immense waves of its grasses. A Russian novelist had written almost a century before the revolutions of 1917, the entire surface of Earth was an ocean of green and gold, sparkled with millions of different flowers. So it had been in the days of the fictional hero Taras Bulba. So too had it been when the rebel Cossack chieftain Ivan Bolshevik, the chieftains, led their followers in some of the greatest uprisings ever known in the history of the Western world. On 4 occasions, between 1600 and 1800, these Cossack leaders had challenged the authority of the autocrats who ruled Moscow and St. Petersburg by forming hordes of oppressed peasants into formidable armies. Always their rallying cry had been freedom for Russia's poor and unfortunate. Knights errant of the Russian common people, the 19th century radical Alexander Herzog once called them, a race of warrior peasants who had lived free until the Empress Catherine the Great had tamed them by tempering the blows her armies dealt the force of the Cossack with promises of privileges and rewards. Thanks to Catherine's artful co-option of their leaders, the Cossacks became the Russian autocrats' most staunch defenders. Cossacks had ridden for the Tsar, faith, and country against Napoleon in 1812, against the armies of England and France during the Crimean War, and against the Turks on at least 4 occasions after Catherine's death. Cossack squadrons had been the government's best weapon during the revolutionary disturbances of 1905, when they had ridden against striking workers, their slashing, weighted whips scattering their victims like so many flocks of frightened geese. In 1904, Cossack cavalry had traveled halfway around the globe to fight the Japanese. In 1914, they had struck terror into the hearts of even the supremely trained German armies, whose soldiers instinctively recoiled from their terrible battle cry, in which their ancestors had first learned to fear during the 7 Years' War a century and a half later. As with old tales of knights errant, legends of the Cossacks as freedom-loving fighters survived long after they became autocracy's bulwark against revolution. For much of the 19th century, peasants in those parts of Russia where Pugachev had won his greatest victories in 1773 and 1774, dated events from the time of his revolt, instead of from the time of Christ, as they waited impatiently for a successor to appear. Revolutionaries in the 20th century knew the importance of such Cossack legends to Russia's masses and tried to use them to political advantage. Even Lenin took care to stress his kinship with Stenka Razin in the struggle against oppression in Russia. Both Reds and Whites, therefore, looked to the Cossacks in 1918. Their former recalled their deeds as long-ago champions in the people's struggle against Russia's czars, while the latter drew comfort from the more recent exploits, as the autocrats' first line of defense against revolution. Yet neither Red nor White understood how seriously the turmoil of the First World War and the revolutions of 1917 had weakened the Cossacks' unity and eroded their sense of common purpose. Nor did they realize how bitterly divided the Cossacks had become among themselves. As they had done for centuries, younger Cossacks had ridden away from the Don in 1914 to add to the glory that their forebearers had won in wars past. None looked to the Cossacks and the Don lands with greater hope than General Mikhail Alexeyev. Short and slight, his slender hands and wire-rimmed spectacles making him appear for all the world like a man who lived by his pen, not by his sword. Alexeyev, at 60, was dying of cancer and only had 11 months to live when Lenin and Trotsky ousted Kerensky for office. Scrupulously honest and content to remain in the background while less deserving men basked in the public acclaim that was rightly his, Alexeyev always had asked much less for himself than for others. During the trying months of the Great War, men better trained in the ways of the imperial court had gossiped about his unassuming nature and simple faith and simpler manners, thought coffee should be drunk during meals rather than afterward. And many had raised their eyebrows in contempt when he had left the dinner table before the Tsar in order to return to his workroom. If you ever see before you a stern-looking general, looking every inch the part, whose countenance reflects his own great appreciation of the grandeur of his position, an admiring future Bolshevik correspondent once wrote, then you are not in the presence of Alexeyev. As the Imperial Chief of Staff, beginning in August 1915, Alexeyev had regrouped Russia's shattered armed forces, rebuilt and rearmed its decimated divisions, and launched new offensives, while the inept and indecisive Emperor Nicholas II had posed as nation's supreme commander. Solely as a consequence of his immense capacity for work and his single-minded dedication to the country, this son of a non-commissioned infantry officer had risen to take full command of Russia's armies in 1917, after the February Revolution had driven the Romanovs from their throne. Yet the revolution that Alexeyev had accepted had promised to lead Russia along the path to Western constitutional democracy. not reshape her around values he found politically dangerous and morally repugnant. Bitterly opposed to every principle for which Lenin and the Bolsheviks stood, Alexeyev refused to accept their victory. Certain that nothing short of military force would dislodge the Bolsheviks, Alexeyev hurried to the south within hours after their victory in the hope that the capital of the Don territory would become a base from which to march against them. Relying upon rich harvests and abundant natural resources of the region to support this effort, Alexeyev intended to restore the order and regularity of civic life that the revolutionary year had destroyed. Still certain, as he had written some months earlier, that the fate of Russia depends on the army, Alexeyev planned to assemble fugitive officers, military cadets, experienced non-coms returning from the front, and especially the Don Cossacks, who, he mistakenly thought, had sufficient strength not only for defense, but for an offense, to form a volunteer army that would defend the Don and, one day, grow strong enough to defeat the Bolsheviks. At best, the volunteer army was a far cry from the military force that Alexeyev had commanded from Russia's supreme headquarters earlier that year. For volunteers proved to be scarce, weapons and ammunition scarcer still, and money scarcest of all. It was touching to see how the former supreme commander of Russia's armies, so recently in command of millions of men, and a billion-ruble budget now scurried and bustled here and there, and fared about, getting a dozen cots, a few sacks of sugar, and tiny sums of money. General Denikin wrote some years later, Alexeyev forced the deaf to hear, and those who slept to awaken, Denikin added in amazement. He dedicated all his strength and energy to what he liked to call his last labor on this earth. The obstacles seemed insurmountable. Nonetheless, Alexeyev insisted that the business of saving the state could best begin on the Don. Russian state authority will establish itself here, he explained. The fragments of the old Russian government that had just been shattered by this unprecedented storm will gradually be put back together into the nucleus of a wealthy state here in the southwest. The prospects for Alexeyev's success looked brighter in mid-November, when the elections for delegates to the Constituent Assembly, 49 out of every 50 Cossacks, had cast their ballots against the Bolsheviks. All too quickly, fugitive generals and politicians who had joined Alexeyev began to dream about broadening their struggle against the Bolsheviks into a national movement. Whoever controls the mineral fuels of the country can exercise the greatest influence on all areas of national life. Thus, the coal of the Don and the wealth of its banks could be used to deprive Central Russia of the food and fuel that the Bolshevik government needed to survive. Then, if the mineral-rich Don could be allied with the grain-rich Ukraine, which already had declared its independence from Lenin's regime, they could pose a powerful threat to Bolshevik power. Although immensely seductive for men whose world had been shattered by the Bolsheviks' victories in Petrograd and Moscow, such a dream ignored the realities of life in the Donlands. Proud of their traditions of freedom and democratic institutions, the Cossacks resented those politicians from Moscow and Petrograd who had appeared so suddenly in their midst and spoke so readily as their representatives. Most of these politicians belonged to the Constituent Democratic or Cadet Party, which had been founded in the wake of the Revolution of 1905, and represented in Russia those basic traditions of European liberalism that had emphasized proper legal procedures, civil liberty, and political democracy. Yet such politicians knew nothing of the Cossacks' own traditions and remained foreigners among them. So quickly did the Cossacks General Alexei Kaledin regret his brief willingness to make common cause with the politicians and generals from the north that he asked many of them to leave before the end of November. Unfamiliar with the society of the Donlands, the whites also failed to anticipate the animosity of the men and women of peasant stock, who now worked in the factories of Rostov, labored in the coal mines of Donbass, and eked out a marginal living in lands rented from Cossack landlords. Drawn by the prospect of richer soil and more temperate climate, Russian peasants have been making their way to the Donlands ever since Catherine the Great had pacified the Cossacks in the 1770s. Yet, unlike those who sought refuge in the Don in earlier times, these peasants had remained aliens. Called Ignodordine by the Cossacks, and destined always to live and labor under heavy disabilities, they made up nearly half of the population in the Donlands in 1917, but owned only a tenth of the land, most of it broken up into tiny parcels of less than 4 acres. Beginning in the late 19th century, rising rents in the Don and nearby Kuban had driven many to seek work in nearby factories or mines. Bitter, poor, and rebellious, they stood ready to support the Bolsheviks against mine owners, factory managers, and Cossack landlords. Before the end of November, a growing bond of common interest encouraged Bolshevik workers to seize control of Rostov and proclaim the Soviet Republic of the Don. With typical Cossack disdain for men and women of proletarian background, Kaledin ordered his men to retake Rostov, only to have the younger men from the front refuse. Then Kaledin returned to Alexeyev and the whites for support. "Let us be like brothers and help each other," he wrote to the Cossacks a few days before, and had been on the point of ordering Alexeyev to leave the Don and build his volunteer army elsewhere. "Let us save whatever we can." Alexeyev's reply reflected the unhesitating willingness to sacrifice personal interests for the general good that had characterized his lifelong service to Russia. "Everything I have at my command," he told Kaledin, "I will gladly give for our common cause." At that point, Alexeyev's volunteer army numbered about 600, yet he sent most of them to fight under Kaledin's command. With their help, the Cossack leader drove the Bolshevik Red Guards from Rostov on December 2nd. The role that the volunteer army played in Kaledin's victory convinced him that he must reach an agreement with those exiled politicians and fugitive generals who insisted that the time had come for the whites to launch a national crusade against the Bolsheviks. To do so proved as difficult as restoring unity among the Cossacks, for if the exiles shared a common hatred for the Bolsheviks, they did not have much affection for each other. The coldly professional cadet leader, Pavel Molotov, remained unrepentingly ignorant, as he insisted that the civilians, not generals, must determine Russia's course. To make matters worse, General Kornilov, who reached the Don 4 days after Kaledin's victory, continued to despise Alexei for carrying out Kerensky's orders to arrest him the previous September. As they searched for common ground upon which to unite during the 2nd and 3rd weeks of December, white and Cossack leaders knew that they could not build a volunteer army without Kornilov's great personal magnetism. But they knew for certain that Kornilov would never serve where Alexeyev commanded. General Denikin long remembered the distressing scene on December 18th, when generals spoke too bluntly and politicians spoke too glibly of self-sacrifice and national need, after Kornilov had threatened to leave the Don and carry his battle against the Bolsheviks to Siberia, unless he received undisputed command of the volunteer army. Only after long hours of bitter debate did the adversaries agree to form a triumvirate that gave Kaledin control of Cossack affairs, placed Alexeyev in charge of civilian diplomatic matters, and installed Kornilov at the head of the volunteer army. General Kornilov, therefore, took command of the White forces in South Russia on Christmas Day, 1917. Once again, the Russian land must arise to defend its holy relics and rights that have been trampled upon, as it did 3 centuries ago. The Russian people, gathered in the south, from all corners of our homeland, will defend to the last drop of their blood this last bastion of Russian independence, this final hope for restoration of a free and great Russia. Kornilov had pitifully little with which to support his heroic words. When he took command, the volunteer army still numbered less than 4,000, most of them still without uniform, winter clothing or rifles. Its first weapons came from troops who had abandoned the war on Russia's western front and were all too eager to discard the instruments of war. Daring raids on Cossack armed depots, and when the desperately limited funds were made, black market run by greedy Cossack quartermasters. On one occasion, some of Kornilov's men boldly stole an entire battery of field guns. On another, they got a company of Cossack gunners drunk on bootleg vodka and bought their entire battery of guns for 5,000 rubles. At one point, volunteer army officers simply borrowed 2 field guns to have a ceremonial artillery salute, and then claimed to have lost them. Such efforts could arm a handful of fighters, but they could not equip the modern army Alexeyev hoped to put into the field against the Red. Because Russia's weapons industries were made in territories under Bolshevik control, every field gun, rifle, and bullet had to be imported into the White Lands, and each had to be paid for before it was delivered. Money thus became particularly crucial to the White success. Maria Nestrovich, an army nurse who served as a messenger for Alexeyev, collected over 70,000 rubles as she traveled clandestinely back and forth between Novorossiysk and Moscow. And sympathetic men and women all across Russia donated silver and gold objects, ranging from military medals and teaspoons to serving dishes and jewelry. Larger sums reached the volunteer army only in mid-December, when anti-communist organizations in Moscow sent over 500,000 rubles, and South Russian banks donated several million more. Even these funds could be little but paid for the volunteer army total wages. To buy weapons and supplies for the army of 20,000 men that they hoped to recruit, Kornilov and Alexeyev needed the support of Russia's former allies. But these governments did not yet share their sense of desperation. While the Whites waited for help, the French, the British, and the Americans continued to debate whom to support and to search for the most effective channels through which to send their aid. Because Westerners still thought the Cossacks as the staunch anti-revolutionaries they had been before 1917, French, British, and American diplomatic and military circles continued to think that Kaledin, not Alexeyev or Kornilov, would provide the best leadership for anti-Bolshevik forces in South Russia. Despite strong protests from diplomats and military men knowledgeable about Russia, they continued to hold that view. With too little understanding of conditions in Russia, the National City Bank of New York hurriedly transferred $500,000 of Imperial Russian government assets to Kaledin, while the chief of Britain's Imperial General Staff sent word to England that that they should grant Kaledin financial support up to any figure necessary. Although his superiors in England's war cabinet hurried to add that such sums would be paid in installments, so long as the recipients continued to struggle. Captivated by the vision that their francs, pounds, and dollars would somehow send divisions of raging Cossacks into battle against what they now perceived as an ungodly union of Bolshevik forces, assisted and controlled by the Germans, Russia's former allies still looked to Kaledin, even after Kornilov took command of the volunteer army. How badly the Allies misread the situation in the Donlands became clear at the end of January 1918, as the Red Guards advanced. Kaledin's authority over the Cossacks collapsed. On January 29, certain that he could not stem the Red's victorious advance in the Donlands, the man whom the Allies had expected to lead the White armies to victory resigned and gave his officers farewell. He walked into the adjoining room and shot himself in the heart. That same day, the leaders of the volunteer army held a particularly acrimonious meeting in Rostov, at which even Denikin lost his temper. "Only the devil knows," he exclaimed as he stormed out of the room, "why we have to have these discussions." At that point, the Whites' leaders were nearly as ready to fight among themselves as they were to confront the Bolshevik forces. For a time, only Alexeyev's peacemaking held them together. Although the Bolsheviks' military forces in those days were no more disciplined than Kaledin's turbulent Cossacks or Kornilov's hesitant volunteers, some of the commanders boasted military records that equaled the best of the White generals. Not all Tsarist officers, and not even all Tsarist generals, fought on the side of the Whites in Russia's civil war. And a number of Russia's senior commanders, a majority of Tsarist general staff officers, according to some reliable estimates, placed their talents at the Bolsheviks' disposal during the year after the October Revolution. Certain that they were acting in the best interests of the land that they loved, these men provided much of the organizational talent that transformed the unruly Red Guards into a highly disciplined Red Army before the Civil War ended. The first Tsarist general to join the Bolsheviks, General Mikhail Bonch-Bruvik, had entered the Great War as a quartermaster general of the Third Army in Galicia and had risen to command the Northern Front at the time of Kornilov's revolt. With a younger brother who had become Lenin's most dedicated disciples, Bonch-Bruvik readily transferred his loyalties to Russia's new order. Within a fortnight after the October Revolution, he became the Bolsheviks' chief of staff and, in February 1918, took command of the defenses of Petrograd. He was joined later by General Alexey Alexeyevich Brusilov, architect of the victorious Brusilov offensive that sent the Russian armies storming into Austria's Galician lands in 1916, and commander-in-chief of Russia's armies between May and July 1917. Brusilov had none of Bonch-Bruvik's ties to New Order, nor did his background mark him in any way as a potential leader in the Red Army. The son of a fighting general in the army of Nicholas I, educated as a courtier in the Imperial Corps of Pages, and married to the cousin of the renowned Imperial Prime Minister Peter Stoiplin, Brusilov compiled an impressive record of victories, while other commanders had suffered defeats. On the eve of the February Revolution, he stood high in the confidence of the imperial government as commander-in-chief of Russia's Southwest Front. 64, when the Bolsheviks seized power, he remained a dashing cavalry officer among proletarians, his body slim and straight, his mustaches still waxed and curled. Yet, aristocrat that he was, Brusilov could not share the Whites' belief that it was better to kill his countrymen than allow them to live under Bolshevism. He therefore remained in Moscow after the October Revolution, and before the end of the Civil War, moved into the Red Army with several of his most trusted adjutants, the youngest of whom was to become hero of the Soviet Union during the Second World War. A man of conscience who loved his country above all, Brusilov in no way merited Genkin's scathing curse that he had lost his honor and virtue by entering the service of the enemies of the Russian people. Men such as Brusilov and Bonkruvich entered the Red Army to organize and plan, not to command in the field. The Bolsheviks drew many of their best field commanders from the ranks of talented Tsarist non-commissioned officers, whose plebeian origins had slowed their promotions in that army. It placed a premium upon birth and wealth. Other Bolshevik commanders had evaded military service during the Great War and only drew their first blood in revolutionary combat. Such was true of Vladimir Antonov Ovchinko, the revolutionary street tactician who commanded the Bolsheviks' attacks against the Winter Palace in October 1917. Antonov's rumpled clothing gave him the look of a down-at-the-heels provincial schoolmaster on the night he arrested the ministers of Kerensky's fallen provisional government. His collar and shirt and cuffs and hands, one of his fastidious prisoners remembered with disgust, were those of a very dirty man. Yet, Antonov's rusty, uncupped hair, wire-rimmed spectacles, and whiskey mustache masked an instinctive sense for tactics and military organization that sometimes crossed the threshold of brilliance. Less than a week after his assault on the Winter Palace, he became commander of the Petrograd Military District and a member of the Central Committee of the People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. Early in December, Lenin gave his command each of the forces being assembled against the Whites in the Donlands, bearing Lenin's promise that the land question in the Don region would be settled in the interest of the toilers among the Cossacks and all working men and women on the basis of programming soldiers. Antonov Ovchinko began his march to the south on December 8, 1917, supported by Red Guards and detachments of revolutionary workers that had been sent from Petrograd, Moscow, and the coalfields of the Donbass. He not only expected to command the loyalty of those proletarians of Rostov, but he hoped to win the Cossacks' land-hungry tenant farmers to his cause. From his headquarters at Kharkov, a city about 250,000, Antonov sent part of his force southwest against the Cossacks and the volunteer army. Supported by more than 100 machine guns, nearly 20 field guns, 5 airplanes, and an armored train, Antonov's Reds outnumbered the Whites by more than 2 to 1, and he began his advance on Christmas Day, 1917. By the time they approached the Donlands, the strength of the assault groups had nearly tripled to more than 20,000. The one-time revolutionary propagandist and organizer thus faced the former supreme commander of Russia's armies. Kornilov had tactical genius, long experience, and the advice of some of the best military minds that the Imperial Russian Army had produced. Although many of his soldiers had never before been subjected to military discipline, and their readiness to obey orders remained completely open to question, Antonov had the advantage of revolutionary fervor, greater numbers, and many more weapons. Considering the disorderly nature of his forces, Antonov moved with surprising speed. Before Karadin's suicide at the end of January, his Red Guard had taken several cities. The Red Army was advancing from the north and from the south. The Red troops were tightening in a ring around these cities, and the volunteer army found itself at its very center. We didn't have the strength to hold out, but our commanders kept trying to shore up our lines by shifting exhausted groups of men from one critical point to another. Briefly, the Whites held, but then they had to retreat. These first battles showed all too vividly the type of fighting that would dominate Russia's civil war. For terror, coldly and brutally applied, became a part of the struggle of red against white from the very beginning. In contrast to the exalted notions of glory that had sent men to war in 1914, raw ideological passions that rivaled those of Europe's 16th and 17th century religious wars and their intensity spurred those Russians now against each other. Their followers, either passionately drawn to the Bolsheviks' credo of class struggle or morally repelled by it, Kornilov and Lenin therefore both sanctioned terror more readily than commanders in Europe's Great War ever had. The greater the terror, the greater our victories, Kornilov told his men as Antonov's Red Guards began their march. We must save Russia, he added later, even if we have to set fire to half of it and shed the blood of 3/4 of all Russians. The Bolsheviks spoke in similarly absolute terms. Trotsky demanded that measures be taken to wipe off the face of the earth the counter-revolution of the Cossack generals and the cadet bourgeoisie, while Lenin organized the Chinka to defend Russia's proletariats against the most heinous of crimes of the whites. Such passions led men to commit atrocities unheard of during the First World War. When a detachment of whites trapped a handful of Bolshevik factory workers in the sleepy seaport town of Tanerov, they blinded and mutilated them before they burned them alive. Antonov's men repaid the Reds in the same court. I shall never forget the terrible impression it made on me the first time they brought in the bodies of 8 tortured volunteers. Denikin wrote later. They had been beaten and cut up so badly, and their faces so disfigured, that their grief-stricken relatives could barely recognize them. Elsewhere, Denikin's men found the body of a man who Antonov's rebels had buried alive after they had cut off his hands and feet and slid open his agony. He had been tortured only because his son had joined the whites. No one emerged from 3 years of such cruelty and terror unscathed. Not only did the experience cripple the body, it deformed the soul as well. As the volunteer army began its retreat on February 22nd, Antonov's forces entered Rostov. Madness came in our wake, General Denikin wrote later. Reckless debauchery, hatred, robbery, and murder filled those towns and cities we had abandoned. Forced to leave their families behind, the men who followed Kornilov faced the certainty that their lives led on to a new course, in which ranks held in earlier times counted for little. Among us marched 2 former supreme commanders of the Russian armies, a former commander-in-chief of one of our fronts, former high-ranking chiefs of staff, corps commanders, and senior colonels, Denikin remembered. Few in number, ragged, hunted and surrounded, the volunteer army stood as a symbol of persecuted Russia, as it wended its way across the wide expanse of the Don and Kuban steppe. Still struggling to moderate Kornilov's dark, consuming hatred for the Bolsheviks and politicians of any sort, Alexeyev shared Denikin's sentiments. We are retreating to the steppe, he wrote to a friend. We must light a lamp so that at least one small flame will continue to shine through the darkness that has descended upon Russia. Driven by a sense of moral duty, one of his officers later remembered, Alexeyev became the spirit and ideology of the first campaign into Kuban. For the next 80 days, the men of the volunteer army endured what its survivors remembered as the icy march, which took them to the wilds of the Kuban steppe that lay to the east of the Black Sea. Tragically ignorant about the region into which they marched, the leaders of the volunteer army hoped to launch a new campaign against Antonov's forces from the city of Ikartudun, a city whose inhabitants included some 25,000 turbulent workers, sympathetic to the Bolsheviks. On March 14th, 1918, as the volunteer army struggled south and southwest through freezing winds and swirling snow, proletarians seized the city, proclaimed their loyalty to Lenin's government, and forced Kornilov to delay his attack while he waited reinforcements. When he approached for a second time at the beginning of April, Kornilov found that the Bolsheviks had a force of some 18,000 ready to bar his way. For 4 days, weary white troops probed the Red-Blue defenses with little success. Then, with food, ammunition, and medicine in desperately short supply, Kornilov ordered a final assault. "I see no way out, except forward," he told the military council on April 12th. "Therefore, I have decided to attack along our entire front tomorrow at dawn. Retreat would bring the slow agony of a certain defeat, while the final assault offered at least a slim hope of success. We all may perish here," he concluded, "but in my opinion, it is better to die with honor." Always the proper aristocrat, the elegant General Sergei Markov, who had once described the purpose of the Kuban campaign as a march to the devil in quest of bluebirds, returned to his quarters after a meeting with few illusions about what the difficulties that lay ahead were. "Put on clean underwear, if you have any," he told his staff with studied indifference. If we don't succeed in taking the city, we'll get killed anyway." Fate gave Markov 2 more months to live, but the next day's events radically changed the future for the volunteer army. When the Red Artillery began to shell the volunteer army with particular ferocity, Denikin urged Kornilov to move his headquarters to a less exposed location, fearful that the whitewashed walls of the small farmhouse which his chief had established as a macro would present too easy a target for the Bolshevik gunners in the valley below. "It's not worth it," Kornilov replied with a shrug. "Tomorrow we're going to launch our final attack." Denikin left, intent upon the progress of the fighting. As the sun rose and warmed the morning air, we heard an explosion in a nearby grove. I saw horses and men quickly scattered. Then there was another explosion, this time nearby. A Bolshevik gunner had fired a high explosive shell directly into the room in which Denikin had left his commander a few minutes before. The door to Kornilov's room crashed open, and a cloud of white plaster dust streamed forth. An officer who was in the corridor remembered. Kornilov lay on the floor, covered in dust, his right leg shattered. Only when they turned the general over did their aides see that a small piece of shrapnel had penetrated his left temple. The daring officer, who had defied death so many times during the great battles of the First World War, lay only moments away from death. Still clad in civilian overcoat he had worn ever since his escape from Baikal, General Denikin took command of the volunteer army. "You have inherited a heavy burden," General Alexeyev said with deep sadness when aides brought him to the farmhouse where Kornilov's body lay. "May God help you.